All right. Welcome to Endless Balls. I'm your co host, Ben Wager, along with Don Gibson. And as you know, we are talking movies from 1965 to 1975. And this is a special year, 1972. It was an amazing year in movies with some amazing movies that came out. But neither one of us picked one of those amazing movies. Although it could be argued that there's some strong points to the movies we picked, but they weren't the super marquee 72 movie listing that you would expect maybe from this year. Although both movies have longevity and they have legacy. But let's go ahead and start by Don introducing your movie.
Yeah, the film that I selected is a real favorite of mine. And it's not a Hollywood film. I think, well, we've done we did a British film before, pretty well been American. This is a film by a German director named Werner Herzog. And the film's called Aguirre, Wrath of God. It did quite well. It had a great critical acclaim. It won the best Oscar that year for Best Foreign Picture. He's considered an example of new German cinema. The Germans were really strong in cinema, definitely in the early going in the 20s and 30s. And then the war kind of messed them up, and their whole industry was thrown akimbo. And in the mid-60s, they started coming back with guys like Fassbinder and Wim Wenders, and Herzog was one of these guys. Herzog's known for making films, his own way. This is one of a couple of films that he made in the jungle. So this was shot in Peru. He then shot another film called Fitzcarraldo a few years later, also in the jungle, fairly nearby, also in Peru. And it's historically, it's really interesting. It's about a guy named Don Lope Aguirre, who was part of an expedition to find El Dorado, the mythical city of gold. And Herzog is really well known for, taking pieces of history or things that are real. He also did a Dracula film, Nosferatu. And he changes them all. He's very creative with his artistic license. And so this isn't really what happened, but it's a sort of mythical, creative look at a search for El Dorado. So we know right from the beginning, obviously it's going to fail because there is no El Dorado. And that sort of feeling of, inevitable disaster is sort of the tone of the film. So you've mentioned a couple of times of seeing films. You remember really seeing the first time very well. And this is one of those films for me. It was when I was older and, I'm maybe early mid-20s. And I just saw this film on a little black and white television set. And I was sort of stunned by it. I just couldn't understand what it was all about. And what is this crazy film about all these conquistadors? And it's fascinating because they're all in full, regalia, and they have a woman that's representing the kingdom of Spain, and she's brought down in a carriage, and it's crazy because they're in the middle of a jungle, and so there's that sort of opulence that's set in the background against this raw jungle. The opening sequence is absolutely gorgeous. It's just this long shot of them descending the Andes out of the mist, and we can see this long train of local people, Incas, that are working as slaves. And then the conquistadors, they're descending through this mist down into the jungle. And there's this haunting score played by this band named Popol Vuh, which is the band's named on it's a god it's based from. And it's very haunting music. And the film also ends with a really haunting scene, very similar long shot, haunting music. And we see, the expedition doesn't end so well. So the film is fascinating for many ways. It's just a great film to watch because it's a pretty interesting story of conquistadors that lost the jungle, and then they're dying and they're being chased by the local people, and there's major dissension amongst them. The actual expedition is supposed to keep looking, and then they realize 10 days into their expedition, this is a disaster. They should probably go back. And so they sent a smaller expedition led by Aguirre. The larger one was led by a guy named Pizarro. And he leads a small expedition. They go out in these rafts. And this scene is one of the great scenes as well, because there's like 3 rafts. So they're going down. They're really on a tributary of the Amazon. And it's a really tumultuous a river with really large currents and going over, rocks. And there's all sorts of, it's a pretty scary scene. And there was no, Herzog is known for shooting things just on the way he wants to shoot them. So in terms of security, if the rafts had flipped or anything happened, these people would be a lot of trouble because they're all wearing really heavy clothing. They're all wearing armor. There's no safety gear. There's no safety boats following them. And so when you watch the scene and you see them, they all look pretty terrified. The characters are worried about going in the jungle, but the actors are actually terrified as well because their lives are in mortal danger. But Herzog liked that stuff. He's like, yes, I want to get mortal danger on the face of my characters. So that's a really effective scene.
I liked there was a lot of interest. I mean, definitely you're right. The movie had a Hollywood kind of anti-Hollywood kind of thing to it. It was obviously shot in a very economically efficient way.
Shoestring.
Yeah, shoestring. And I read that they shot the whole thing in sequence as well because they didn't really have a lot of other options. And there's a lot of interesting backstory to it's almost it would have been very interesting to see a documentary on the making of this movie, as a separate movie, because there is a huge amount of understanding the history of this, Pizarro, who was, essentially one of the most successful conquistadors, when we think about the conquering of the New World, Cortez, and then it goes Pizarro, because he conquered the entire Inca Empire with about 127 guys. It was stunning what he was able to do. And his success. And this little side story is it's an interesting little side story because it shows I think it showed in a very realistic way the struggles that these people were under, because essentially, all of these men are driven by, profit. There's nothing else that these men joined this as the conquistadors to profit, because most of them were ex-soldiers who had fought in Spain against the Muslims, essentially, to retake Spain. And when that war ended, they had all these soldiers and they didn't have anything to do with them, what to do with them. So that, a big part of this new world exploration was to, put these guys on ships and send them over to the New World and see what happens, because that was, they didn't have a lot of other options. They were all, looking for, more opportunities to do their career, which was, fighting for the most part. And so, they were driven by profit, and you kind of see the motivation of a lot of the characters based on this idea of like, okay, you're the leader, but man, if you can't get us where we need to go, or the allegiances were quick to switch. It was very interesting how Aguirre, he had a very good understanding of the motivation and the pulse of the men that he was with, much better than the other guy who Ursua. He was the commander of the initial break off Pizarro ordered, right? And he was of noble blood, and so Aguirre saw an opportunity to kind of, mutiny and take over the leadership when Ursua lost confidence in his decision-making, and there was a lot of hiccups with what was happening and the loss of the rafts and, all the struggles. And so, and it kind of reminded me almost a little bit of the way that Klaus Kinski, the man who played Aguirre, the lead of he had kind of a Richard the Fifth. Is it Richard the Fifth? With it almost like he had a hunchback kind of.
That's Richard the Third, yeah.
Richard the Third, it almost had that kind of. He was playing it like the Richard the Third character in Shakespeare, He
totally was, yeah.
Go ahead.
And in terms of the analysis of the time, in terms of what you're talking about, the sort of the motivation of the people and the sort of political environment, a lot of people think that this was a metaphor actually for the rise of Hitler. And so the group was sort of lost, and they didn't know what they're doing. They had their motivation was, they didn't know where they were going. And the only reason they were there was to find the city of gold. And when they were being reasonable, saying, you know what, maybe this isn't going to work, we should go back, they just we have to go. And Aguirre uses, fear and violence he kills a couple of key people and says, who's with us? And if you're with us, great. If you're not, we're going to kill you. And that was all there was to it. And so everyone went along with them. They were hoping for the city of gold. There's always these references, soon we'll be there. but eventually you can see everyone's thinking this is not working out. And that same people were talking about most of the Germans in their analysis of this, they were saying it's the same thing. We were promised all this stuff, and we believe in the beginning we're thinking this is great, and then further going down, you're realizing, what did we do? We just gave control of our lives to a madman. So a lot of people think it's this sort of political allegory.
You know, and I could see that, but you know, it's funny. I thought of it more as, because it was filmed in you know, the early '70s. I connected it very much to and being in the jungle, to the realities of Vietnam, and you know, the ideas of the Vietnam War, and that these men are kind of, you know, cajoled into going there for the ideology of you know, we have to stop the spread of communism, and you have to fight for them. You know, this is a threat to America, and da 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 da. And then when they get there, they're like, these people don't give a shit. They don't care about us at all. They just want to live, and we're, you know, we're stuck here trying to fight this enemy that we can't really identify. They're in the jungle, and it was just very similar to the Indians and the arrows, and just kind of ambushing them all the time. And everybody's kind of clueless, and they don't really understand the goal anymore. It was like this mythical thing, you know, fight communism, stop the spread. But then Vietnam just turned into this horrible situation that never really worked out, and it very much connected to that. And you know, as you probably know, you know, when we look at some films that came shortly after this, Apocalypse Now was the motivation of a lot of the style of Apocalypse Now supposedly was influenced by, you know, Aguirre, The Wrath of God.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's just generally it's the idea of the colonial mentality of, we're strong and we have some sort of technology, and we're just going to overpower whoever we show up against. And, you know, historically that worked. I mean, as you said, that they destroyed both the Aztecs and the Inca empires pretty easily with a lot of subterfuge, and they were really good at doing it. But eventually, I mean, when we look at it lens from today and we look back at all these things, how misguided the thinking is. And that's why I like the story so much, because it's a very simple story, and you figure out pretty quickly this is going to go really badly, but it's really kind of entrancing. The imagery, lots of really great scenes, a lot of stuff about the church is a very strong representation in this film. There's a priest that's part of it. You think he's going to have good moral guidance. He gives basically nothing, and it's just a good sort of allegory for the way, you know, society works or is misguided. You did mention about a documentary. There wasn't a documentary specifically made about this film, but there was a documentary called My Best Fiend, which is a documentary about the relationship between Herzog and Klaus Kinski. He made 5 films with him. And Klaus Kinski is an incredibly intense person. And their relationship is, you know, there's a rumor on the set that Kinski was going to leave, and Herzog held a rifle to his head and said, if you leave, I'm going to shoot you in the head. And you know, a lot of this is mythic, but that whole relationship people love talking about. And that's a great film in itself, My Best Fiend, all about their background.
Yeah, I read some things about Klaus Kinski, and you know, he was a twisted bastard, it sounds like, you know, I mean, and Werner, you know, harnessed that, you know, because he would they actually had one of the big conflicts they had in the movie was how to play Aguirre, right? Because Warner wanted him to be the way he is in the movie, where it's kind of like he's got this weird wiry energy, but it's kind of low key and behind the scenes a little bit, like trying to manipulate things through others. I want to make this big fat lord dude the new commander, you know, and then manipulate through that. You know, he was always looking for opportunities to make sure things are getting done, but he didn't want to be the face all the time of everything. And so that low key kind of sneaky energy that he ended up playing wasn't what Klaus wanted to do. Klaus wanted to be like this raging maniac, right? Probably more the Hitler, you know, stereotype. And there was huge conflict on the set because, you know, Klaus was constantly saying, no, I want to play it this way. And so apparently Warner would just enrage him purposefully before every shot just to get all that energy out. And then after he kind of calmed down, he'd shoot the next scene with him. And so he was manipulating his emotions. And it was horrible for the rest of the cast, because the rest of the cast was suffering, because I mean, he was physically abusive, verbally abusive, total psychopath through the whole thing. And apparently, I mean, throughout his life, the guy was, you know, accused of being a sexual molester of his own children. And I mean, he's got a horrible history. His legacy is just destructively bad.
Yeah. And he's not super well known in American culture. He's very well known in German culture. He's one of their, he was a great film star and stage star from the 50s through the 70s. And so he was like, you talked about the shoestring budget. His salary was like a third of their budget. Everyone else was a no name. A lot of natives were hired, and the major portion was him. And it was the first time that Herzog worked with him. And so it's really interesting how their dynamic started. And a lot of people think that Kinski resented Herzog because this film did very well critically and financially. And it kind of made Klaus Kinski's name in North America. And a lot of people were sort of like, oh, you're in Herzog's film. And he kind of thought it was his film. And he was quite a self-centered, difficult person to work with. So
yeah. It sounds, and then, I never really, I didn't understand the last scene with the monkeys.
Yeah, well.
Do you have anything that you can share about that perspective?
The idea is, actually, that's been sort of played with. The Simpsons did a variation of that scene years ago. The idea is he's left alone. Everyone's dead, and he's now the emperor of a kingdom of monkeys. Is
that what it is? It's just like a very literal. He's the king of the monkeys.
And Herzog is really, moving into the candidate. The candidate has a very open-ended ending as well. It's not as open-ended, but it's just this idea of what happens next. And it seems pretty clear. He's alone in the jungle. He's around a bunch of monkeys, so he's probably going to die. But the idea, and where do the monkeys come from? We have no clue. There's like 300 monkeys suddenly on the raft, and then he's chasing them all around. He's grabbing them, and it's once again, it's sort of a figurative or metaphorical.
Yeah. Thing. I think they got a good deal on monkeys. I don't know, but So anyway, overall, it's an acquired taste, Aguirre, Wrath of God, because when I first watched it, I was like, but as I've digested it over the few days, it's actually, it does stick to you a little bit. You get a little bit more. It's a thinker. So after you're watching it for a while, it just stays with you a little bit. So that's kind of how I left it. I enjoyed it more after it was over than the actual during the movie.
Fair enough. Well, it's a film, you definitely don't want to watch late at night. It's quite slow at times. There's moments that are pretty good, but if you're going to watch it starting at 11 o'clock, you're in trouble. But I've watched it, 25 plus times. And so I love it. It's definitely a film that when you see it 2-3 more times, you're like, oh, what's going on here? And it's all this stuff starts to reveal itself. But
it's got to be in the rotation, does it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's good. I think, overall it was a worthy movie to watch and talk about. And I think we covered it quite well. Moving on to more of a mainstream movie, I picked The Candidate, which is a movie starring Robert Redford. And the director, I believe, was a guy named, what's his last name? Ritchie?
Yeah, Michael Ritchie.
Michael Ritchie, yeah. And I picked it mostly because last week we were in a major election, and I thought it would be interesting, kind of a topical movie. And the interesting thing is, you really see the machine of politics is a big part of this movie. It's really showing you how, regardless of who the candidate is, there's a machine and there's a role, and you are a piece in this machine. And you're going to be built into this thing that they want you to be, so that you will match this premise of what they want elected. And it was a time in our country with television and more visualization of the politicians, that we're seeing that machine has to, it's looking for a good-looking kind of that Robert Redford look, which interesting enough is still, we see that a lot even more, obviously, because, people are more sensitive. But the idea of this movie is that Robert Redford's a young do-gooder, social reformer, works in like a community law clinic to help, those who need representation, social justice, crusader type. And but his father was a major player. His father was the governor of California, and so he has this name legacy. And so this campaign manager who had just lost an election, he's looking for that next big thing, and he manufactures this whole Senate race based around the character's name is Bill McKay, and then he basically, he sells McKay on, and he's reluctant at first. Robert Redford's character, Bill McKay, he's like, why would I be this person? That's not me. That's not who I am. And the guy who plays the campaign manager is what's his name? Is it I was Peter? Is it Peter?
Peter Boyle.
Peter Boyle, who is a great actor who's been around forever. He was if you've seen Everybody Loves Raymond, he was Everybody Loves Raymond. He was the dad in Everybody Loves Raymond, which was basically his most identifiable role in the later part of his life. But he was also in a lot of supporting roles in movies. One of his more famous movies in the 70s, besides this, was Young Frankenstein. He played Frankenstein, and but he's a very good actor, and this was at the prime of his career. And he plays the campaign manager, and he has a very pragmatic view about everything, and so he's done it so many times. He knows what to say, and he knows how to motivate people to get to do things that they're hesitant to do, and he starts, we see Robert Redford's character kind of having to compromise more than he wants to, and he's fighting with that within himself. And, he wants to have these conversations with the campaign manager in private, all in these weird, strange places throughout the movie, where they're just kind of, I need to talk to you. And then they're inside like the cockpit of an airplane, or in the elevator with some service elevator with some, hotel guy going, you can't be here, and it's just always these weird little places where they're having these very serious conversations about the campaign. And the idea is that, he fights to not be put into this role that is going to allow him to win. But then in the end, he puts himself in this role that allows him to win. And then he's kind of lost himself. And he doesn't even know who he is anymore. And once this objective is achieved, as you said, at the end of the movie, he looks at the guy and he goes, what do we do now? Because he's so lost in this process that I feel like he doesn't know what the next step is. And the irony is that if we showed that if they had like the Candidate 2 or whatever politician, the sequel to this movie, we'd see this guy who has probably embraced this role, and he knew exactly, and he evolved into this professional politician, which is, what we see a lot now in our political discourses. So it's an interesting evolution of a do-gooding type person that turns into this figure that is the machine of politics turned him into. And it's dated because now it's it's a lot more evil, and it's a lot more manipulative than back then. But you definitely saw how the machine was being created on the East Coast it's much more developed, but on the West Coast it was more of something that was new to people, I think. And so or it was a different type of machine. Anyway, I thought the movie was interesting. I liked the movie. I mean, I might have I've never seen it before. This was the first time I'd seen it, but looking back at it, I could see that, the game has changed, and it's much more of a big time thing. And I don't know if this would hold up as much.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you're right. That's trying to portray politics as, as you say, you have a guy that really wants to do the right thing, and he probably wouldn't be very good at representing people's points of view, especially people that need it. But there's a real naivete when you look at it 50 years later, and we've been through 4 years of Trump, and it's not just Trump. I mean, you look at the Mitch McConnell Senate race and Lindsey Graham, and also the Bush Dukakis 88 campaign. There was a lot of, talk about manipulation and use of media, and they do all that. They focus on, okay, we're gonna do this soundbite with you, and there's a scene where he's actually helping some women in a housing
clinic,
center,
like a public clinic.
Yeah, and they don't want his help, and they're like, "What do you want here?" There's 2 or 3 black women and him, and there's this awkward moment, and we're like, and they're trying, okay, we're not going to use that. We're going to use other stuff, and we're like, okay, this is the manipulation of political campaigns has become an awful lot more insidious and sophisticated than what they're portraying here. But definitely, as you said, the same sort of feeling of what the political world is like. You know, the guy he's running against, this incumbent governor who is just Mr. Slick, and there's a forest fire. He shows up 10 minutes later in a helicopter, and he does the press conference, and he promises aid, and he leaves, and he's this well-oiled machine, and he's shown as like the system that it'll never be broken. But the funny thing here is, we, as you said, we have people like that, McConnell and Lindsey Graham, that people went in to change it, and they still got destroyed by 15%. And even though each campaign had $40 million behind it, and so there's a naivete that if you just get the right campaign manager and you know how to manipulate things, you'll bring down the evil guy that's been there for too long.
Yeah, I think, it's not just a Republican thing. I think it's also a Democrat thing. I mean, it's, in our country now, the way things work is, most political races aren't even competitive because they've gerrymandered the boundaries, and the Senate races are different because it's a statewide race. And this was a Senate race, by the way. And so it's set up a little differently because they've got but I mean, the idea of, the machine backing the candidate, you can't run these things if you don't have that machine behind you, because, the money right now is, it costs, tens of millions of dollars to run a House of Representative campaign, but it can be $100 million for a Senate campaign now, especially in a larger state. And, and the presidency is a couple $1 billion kind of thing now. And it's just crazy, the money that's involved. And you see that a little bit in this, because, he has to go to these fundraisers. He's got to pretend to kind of be this other person. And sometimes he goes off script, and all of his handlers just wince. And usually it works for him because he's so charming and handsome and he can play it off. But, they get upset because why did he say that? And he was just being real. He was like showing him his previous real self, and they're like pissed off that he even would dare to do that, And a lot of times, he was saved because of some situation, like his father swoops in and decides to endorse him. And that saves him after a debate where he kind of went off the script and gave the other guy a lot of opportunities to, kind of close out the debate. And, but you see that when he tries to show his real self, everybody gets upset. And so when he plays the role, he's going down the right path that was predestined by this machine, then the success, he feels that success, and it kind of tampers down a little bit more of him being real every time.
Well, one thing I found quite interesting in this film was the portrayal of his wife and his relationship with his wife, because in the beginning we see her and she seems to be pretty, she's artistic, she's a photographer. We see her doing that. That kind of vanishes pretty quickly. And then when she hears that he can run for Senate, she comes across as, oh, hey, I could move to Washington and be a senator's wife. And she sort of gets into that. And then their relationship sort of there's moments where there's passion, but otherwise he's just busy doing what he's doing. And there's this really odd scene where they're looking for him. And then we're going down the hotel hallway, and then like a campaign woman working the campaign comes out of the hotel room, and he comes out 5 seconds later. So it's definitely implied that they were off,
Oh yeah. He had an affair. Yeah, that was definitely, that was
not developed at all. There's just that scene, and then we're moving on, and like, okay, that was just something that happened. It was
well, I mean, in the guys waiting in the room for him, they're talking about it. Like they're kind of they're kind of he's not available right now, because remember they said, oh, his car is running late, and some woman goes, no, he's in the hotel, and then and then
I thought that whole thing was really interesting because but that character, we don't really see her again. It was just he's on the road now.
We see her periodically. There's like these little glimpses of attractiveness. It develops a little bit at the beginning. She's kind of, he gave at her longingly kind of thing. And she's around the handlers at certain events. She's definitely around, but, it's the funny thing is that, that's happening so much. And because Kennedy was, Kennedy kind of blew that up because he was like a woman's man, and there was all these, affairs. But I mean, everybody knows these guys were all playing around. And, the more the television era shows up and the more the media has access, then Clinton gets caught, and there's so many There's so many, I mean, now it's like, oh, I fucked a porn star and paid him off, whatever. Trump is like broken the rules, just taking that down. And so it's so funny that I mean, Trump is horrible. Obviously, some people, and probably both of us would say that he wasn't what we consider to be the role model for children as a president. I want my kid to be the next president, but not that president. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the film, I was really interested in how they just underplayed it. It was just like there, and it wasn't really part of the narrative. It just happened, and then we moved on to something else.
It's part of the business. They just said that's just part of the game.
Yeah. And in terms of his portrayal, I see so much Robert Kennedy and the way they portrayed him being a man of the people, an attractive guy, very sharp and charming, and meeting people and everyone, all the young girls wanting him to sign their bodies and the hysteria at the press conference, the press event, the political events later on. And there's a big one where he's surrounded by when he's making a speech, and it looks this was done in 1972 and Kennedy was killed in 1968, and for me it just seemed like, man, that seems modeled exactly after what happened if Kennedy wasn't killed, and maybe he would have been a senator in California. Who knows what would have happened next? You
certainly got the sense like, is there going to be some shooter at some point? It felt like that. But overall, it's an interesting movie. It certainly kind of it kind of projects a little bit of the future of politics that, because it wasn't, even now today, we're seeing all of that stuff elevated to the 10th degree, so it did kind of give us, when we look at it now, it's almost like a history.
Yeah.
It's almost like a history movie about, what politics would become, because now it's way past what that movie was trying. And that movie was supposedly satirical. And, and now we look at it and just go, wow, that's just like a documentary almost,
And 3 years later, All the President's Men came out, the portrayal of Watergate, which was not satirical. It was like,
that was
basic documentation of Bernstein's, the whole.
Oh yeah, no, it's a fantastic movie.
Fantastic, but it's
and also starring Robert Redford.
Starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman.
Yeah,
this is like precursor to an awful lot of political films that have followed, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, and we see a lot more of the political genre, coming out of the early '70s, and then and all the way up. We still every once in a while we get these big blockbuster political movies that are still coming out. So definitely impacted the whole future of filmmaking in one area, So overall, I'd say these were two interesting movies we picked, and they were worth seeing again or seeing for the first time. And definitely, I would recommend both these movies to people who are curious and risk takers and want to learn a little bit about the various aspects of different cinema or different times. And so I was very satisfied, and
glad to hear it.
Yeah. I'm glad we explored these, because it was easy to go to The Godfather or Cabaret, one of these big blowout movies from that time. But we both took movies that were not necessarily the movie from 1972.
Yep.
So next, I think we're going to go on to 73 to 75, right?
That's good.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for listening. And Don, it was good seeing you again. And I'll see you next time on The Corner. All right, buddy?
See ya.
Bye-bye.